Hello, woodworkers. Today I want to talk to you about woodworking planes. Now, when most woodworkers think of planes, they're usually thinking of bench planes like these I have laid out here in front of me. These are the workhorses of a typical wood shop, especially if you're doing a lot of handwork or preparing boards by hand. The bench planes are the ones that you're going to go to most frequently in order to do the bulk of your work. They're used for flattening and smoothing boards, preparing them for finishes, dimensioning them, and so forth. And so typically, the way that a bench plane would be used has a lot to do with the way that it's set up. But typically, woodworkers would think of the smoothing planes as the lower numbered planes in the Stanley system. So that's the 2, 3, and 4 planes. They think of a jack plane or a 4 plane as being a 5 or maybe a 6. And then they think of joining planes as being 6, 7, or an 8. Bench planes also include low angle planes, such as this low angle jack plane by Veritas, which I use in my shooting board. Or it could be, rather than these metal Bailey planes, it could be wooden planes, such as these craftsman-made joiner and smoothing planes that I happen to have. However, what I want to talk about today are what I call specialty planes, which are planes that are really used, instead of for dimensioning and preparing wood, they're really used for joinery or for inlay work or other sorts of special purposes like that. So let's get started. So the planes I'd like to talk to you today about are like those that I have laid out here on my workbench. They serve a number of different special purposes. What I plan to do is go through all of these different types, some in more detail than others, those that I think might be of particular interest to beginners or intermediate woodworkers that I think most people who are doing any kind of handwork might want to have in their shop. And then some other more specialized things that chances are you'll never need, but maybe it's good to be aware of them anyway. Or if you're a real tool nut like me, maybe you just enjoy having them for that time you just might need it. So we're going to talk about block planes, which are like these over here. I think that's an essential tool in any woodworking shop. You probably already have one, but if you don't, or if you're kind of wondering about different types of block planes and what they can be used for, we'll talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about shoulder planes. We're going to talk about rabbet planes. Shoulder planes and rabbet planes have a lot of things in common, but also some things that are significantly different about them. We'll talk about the similarities and differences when you might use one and when you might use the other. In talking about rabbet planes, we're also going to talk about moving philoster planes. These are wooden-bodied moving philoster planes. This old Stanley number 85 is often called a rabbet plane, but actually technically it really can be a moving philoster plane as well. So moving philoster planes don't have to be wood, and shoulder planes don't have to be metal. The material is immaterial. It's really how it's designed, how it's set up, and so forth that really determines what kind of plane it is. We'll definitely talk about router planes like these up here. That's another one that I think is pretty essential for woodworkers to have. We will talk about combination planes like the famous Stanley 45, the Stanley 55, and the lesser known Stanley 50, which is a sweet little plane. We're going to talk about plow planes like these over here, which again I think is something that is something you might want to consider getting depending on the type of woodworking you're doing, especially if you're doing cabinetry. These are great planes to have and use. Some planes I will not be talking about in this presentation are things like spoke shaves, which are really just a different kind of plane. Scratch stocks, which can be either homemade or commercially made. Scraper planes, which serve much the same purpose as a cabinet scraper, but more convenient in some ways. And rabbet edge planes or edge rabbet planes, such as this Stanley and Veritas version here. These are more specialized items for very specific uses that many woodworkers would really not have a need for, and so I won't be covering them in this presentation. Also not covered in this presentation are planes like these, molding planes, which are planes often with wooden bodies that have very specific profiles on the bottom in order to cut particular kinds of moldings. Often these are for architectural use, for making houses and other kinds of structures, trim in houses, although there are a few that woodworkers might be interested in too. And also in this category are hollows and rounds, which you may have heard of. Hollows and rounds are sort of generic molding planes that can be used to make a number of different styles of molding, shapes of molding, and so forth through a combination of different widths and sizes and radiuses of planes. Fascinating things, but not things we're going to cover in this presentation. The first so-called specialty plane that I want to talk to you about is a block plane. A lot of people might not consider this a specialty plane in the sense that I think a lot of woodworkers consider it an essential tool for the shop. Even if you do a fair amount of just power woodworking with power tools, chances are pretty good you're probably going to have a block plane sitting around somewhere. And if you don't, you should. It's probably the plane that I use most often for just a wide variety of tasks. I'm just constantly using my block planes in the shop, and I hope I can convince you that it's really something you should have. The first thing I'll say about block planes is, and this applies, I feel, to any tool, it is worth spending the extra money to get a high quality tool. Doesn't mean you have to go broke. If you shop around, you can maybe find something used. A high quality plane does not necessarily mean you have to spend a fortune, but on the whole, you pretty much get what you pay for. If you go for a more expensive, more sturdy, well-built plane, you will not regret it. The old saying is that if you buy an expensive tool, you only cry once. And I found that to be true. Often when I have purchased a replacement tool, it's because I've purchased an inferior quality tool and had to replace it later with something that's better just because I was so frustrated using the cheap tool. So I ended up buying the tool twice. If I just paid the money up front for a good quality tool in the first place, I would have been much happier. I think that high quality tools actually do make a person a better woodworker. There's a few different things to know about block planes. First thing to know is, and this is true for a lot of different kinds of planes, and this is true for bench planes, for example, and that is that there are different bed angles for the blades. You'll notice these two Stanley Sweetheart block planes here are very similar in configuration, but they do have one key difference, and that is the angle at which the blade is fastened into the plane. So you notice this one here has a higher angle, and this one here has a lower angle. I don't think you need both of these. I think if you have a good quality, low angle block plane, that's going to do the vast majority of things that you're going to need a block plane for. First of all, low angle planes are much better for trimming end grain. That's a lot of what you might end up using a block plane for, such as trimming the bottom of a leg or trimming off the end of a peg, that kind of thing. Those are end grain work, and a low angle block plane works much better for that than a sort of a standard angle plane. So anything you're going to use the standard angle block plane for, I think you're going to use the low angle plane for also. Another thing to look for on planes that I think is a very useful feature is something that has an adjustable mouth. If you're taking a bigger cut, generally you want to open the mouth. You're setting the blade a little deeper, taking a heavier cut. But if you're taking lighter cuts, you want to close up that mouth so that you get less tear out, smoother shavings and so forth. So an adjustable mouth will make your block plane more versatile. Another difference in some block planes you want to watch out for is there are sort of standard block planes, and then there are rabbeting block planes. This is an example of a rabbeting block plane, and I'm going to talk more about rabbeting planes in general when I get to that kind of plane. However, the key difference is that a rabbeting plane will have a blade that goes all the way to the edge of the plane, and this is so you can get up into corners, such as in the corner of a rabbet or up against some other surface. It's very handy for getting that shaving all the way into the corner up to the inside edge of something. So a rabbeting block plane can be handy. I don't think it's something you have to go out and buy as one of your first specialty planes, but they are nice to have for certain special uses. So there are some people who use a rabbeting block plane as their only rabbeting plane, but I'll talk more about that when we talk about rabbeting planes. Some rabbeting planes, such as these two block planes, come with a right and a left configurations so that you can work the grain in different directions. If you're working against the grain, as you know, you can get tear out or just leave a really terrible finish. So if you have two planes, a matched set of planes that are skewed in opposite directions, that can maybe be helpful in terms of helping to work with difficult wood or difficult grain. Again, it's not necessary, but it's a nice feature. Other rabbeting block planes just have a blade that comes straight across, like this Lee-Nielsen plane, and it has a blade that comes up to the edge on both sides. So here you just need one. The blade is not skewed, and so you don't get the advantage of a skewed blade, but these work perfectly fine. And again, one plane as opposed to two planes that you're having to keep sharp, fuss with, and so forth. This is certainly fine for a rabbeting plane. But again, you don't really need rabbeting planes. What you really need is a good quality standard block plane, one you're going to keep close to your bench at all times. I have some preferences about these. These are Stanley Sweetheart models, kind of recent Stanley Sweethearts. They have a lot of nice features. There's a mix of iron and brass in them. They're really, I think, very attractive planes. I just don't happen to care for them for a few reasons. One, the edges on them are very sharp, so you really kind of want to work those down with a file or a little sandpaper or something to take the edges off them. These were originally so sharp you could cut yourself on the edges of the planes, and I think that was really kind of an oversight or a weakness in manufacture. These have a knob here for adjusting the depth. It works pretty well, has an adjustable mouth. The main thing I find about these is they're really overly heavy. These things are really, really heavy. I haven't weighed one to give the exact number, but compared to the other block planes here, these are substantially heavier. And it, frankly, it's kind of fatiguing to work with if you're working in the shop all day. So they're nicely made planes. I think they're very good quality. But for me, I didn't care for them. The planes I really go to on a regular basis are these two Lee-Nielsen planes, which are solid. I think this is brass instead of bronze. I could be wrong. They could be bronze. But anyway, these are the planes I use all the time. They fit nicely in the hand. They're extremely well made. They're easy to adjust, get good results. The brass, they're just heavy enough to feel good in the hand and give you some mass as you're working, but they're not so heavy or bulky like the Sweethearts where it's a problem. I think these are just terrific planes. They're easy to work with, good quality metal. They're not cheap, but like I said, you get what you pay for, and I have never regretted the money that I have spent on these. I have both of these sizes. This little one is just great for just chamfering the edge of things. It's probably the one I pick up the most often. Sometimes it's nicer to have something a little larger, and so this one I have also. I use it fairly frequently as well. The traditional block plane is this Stanley. Stanley made a lot of different styles of block planes. Again, I would look for one that has an adjustable mouth. There's different styles of adjustable mouths on different models of Stanley planes, but they work well. This one has a sort of a lever lock to it to get the blade in and out. Other ones have kind of a snap cap or some other kind of mechanism. And then the blade adjustment varies from different designs too. Some have the lateral adjustment here to adjust the angle of the blade right and left and to get a nice even cut, or maybe even an even cut. There are sometimes when you might want that, when you might want the blades slightly skewed one direction or another. But then the blade depth adjustment here varies a lot from different models of Stanleys. This is an older one. It's a good solid cast plane. It's a 9.5. It's a great plane. I'm glad I have it. I don't really use it so much, but as a nice kind of full-size block plane, it's a good plane. And these can be had very inexpensively. If you shop around, you can find these for 15 bucks, 20 bucks, 25 bucks. I think even if you spend 35 or 40 for ones in really great condition that has nice features and nice brass hardware, I think it's worth the money, and it's definitely a less expensive option than some of the newly made planes from Veritas or from Lee-Nielsen or the newer Stanley models. So this is a good investment. I have a bunch of these that I picked up over the years from used tool sales, yard sales, that kind of thing, that my students use in my woodworking class at my school. They work well. So if you're looking for kind of a good cost-effective option for a low-angle block plane, these Stanleys do really well. One more thing I'll mention about these little Stanley block planes. The Stanley design was copied by a lot of other manufacturers. Miller's Falls is one, and so forth. They're often excellent quality also. Planes that were made back in the early part of the 20th century are sometimes often the best made. They have refined the designs. The quality of the manufacture was quite high. Once we get into planes that were made in World War II, the quality of materials start to drop off because of shortages during the war. And then after the war, as woodworkers moved more and more towards machinery for the woodworking, the hand tool quality kind of dropped off. The market for them kind of dropped off, and so they ended up making them cheaper and cheaper in order just to keep sales up, I think. So the later Stanley planes made after World War II, I think a lot of people would feel like they're not quite as good a quality as the older ones. But these pre-World War II Stanleys, Miller's Falls, and some of those other American tool manufacturer companies are really good values.
One of the most common tasks in my shop for a block plane is to chamfer the bottoms of legs for a table, desk, or something of that sort. So here I am using a block plane to chamfer the edges, and I'm counting the number of strokes so that I put the same amount of chamfer on all four sides of the cut. The other frequent use for a block plane in my shop is for chamfering the edges of board. So here I'm checking the grain direction, make sure I'm going to plane in the correct direction so I don't rip up the edge. And I just do 2-3 strokes at 45 degrees to the corner. That takes the corner off. And then I just do another stroke or two at an angle higher than 45, and another stroke or two at an angle lower than 45. And there I'm done. It's an easy chamfer on the edge of a board. In my shop, I'm frequently pegging mortise and tenon joints, and so here, really quickly, I'm showing how I make pegs for my joints. I'm using a Lie-Nielsen doweling plate here. It's just a series of sharpened holes, and you take a square peg that you've ripped off on the bandsaw, and you drive it down through the holes, going from larger holes to smaller holes, until you get the peg the size you want. So now here I'm ready. I've glued a peg in place. I'm sawing it off close to the surface with any kind of saw, and now I'm using my block plane to plane that peg nice and close to the surface. You notice I skew the blade of the plane. I'm not going straight in the direction that I'm moving the plane. The plane is actually at about a 45-degree angle to the direction that I'm moving it in order to get that shearing action. A few quick strokes. Now I've got my peg nice and flush to the surface.
All right, so let's talk router planes. Router planes are wonderfully versatile tools in the shop, and I have to confess I did not realize how much I would use one until I got one and started putting it to use. It can be used in its conventional mode for cutting down the depth of a groove or a dado, but also they can be used in joinery to clean up joints, and I'll be demonstrating that. Router planes come in all kinds of different sizes. Here's a Veritas tool that's you might think of as a full-size router plane. Those are based on the Stanley models. Here's a Stanley number 71, very similar in sort of shape and format with a few different details there in terms of the two, but they work much the same way. These have interchangeable blades. Here on the Stanley, you'll see there's a blade with a rectangular tip here, but you can get a blade that's sharpened to a point for getting into corners. That can be very useful. And here's another blade for this plane that's just simply a narrower blade for more detailed work. So the blades are interchangeable for different purposes. Here are a couple of other plane sizes. Here is a Veritas medium style router plane. I actually don't have a blade in it. It takes the same blades as the full size one, but I don't happen to have a blade in it at the moment. And here's their small router plane for more detail work. I use this one quite a bit actually for inlay work, because I'll demonstrate for you. And again, you can get different blades for it. Here's a blade with a rectangular tip, and here's a blade with a pointed tip here for getting into corners and for detail. Router planes have two basic blade configurations. They look quite different, but they work much the same way. Traditionally, with these Stanleys and the Veritas, these blades have a shaft that comes down vertically and then a blade that comes out at an angle in order to cut it at the proper angle. The blade can be screwed on the way this one is, or sometimes they're cast or molded as one piece, or perhaps soldered together. Here for this smaller blade, this is permanently affixed here on the end of the shaft. So that's one way the blade might be fastened into the plane and function. The other way, and I think this might actually be the older method, is like this, where the blade comes down at an angle, much the way a chisel might if you're using a chisel bevel down, and the blade is held at an angle here by the castings or the machining of the plane. You will see a lot of older wooden planes that are designed this way. They have a straight blade that comes down, and the wooden body of the plane holds the blade at the proper angle to function as a router plane. Sometimes those are called old woman's tooth or hag's tooth type planes. They're very, I think, easy to make at home. So if you have a chisel, you want a router plane, take a chisel and a little bit of woodworking, you can make yourself a router plane. This one I found on Amazon.com very inexpensively, made overseas. I believe it's made out of stainless steel. It's quite heavy and substantial. I think well made. I think it only cost me about $39 or $49. It was not very expensive for a brand new tool. Nice wooden handles, and this has the blade that comes down at an angle like a chisel. It locks into place here, and it has a fine adjustment for the depth. So for the money, I thought this was quite a nice plane. I've used it a couple of times. It functions beautifully. One feature you'll sometimes see on a router plane, especially the larger ones, is an option for a fence. So this would be here so that you could run the plane along the edge of a board and cut a groove or a dado in the wood using the router plane. I personally don't happen to use mine that way. This Stanley came with this fence, but I've never used it, frankly. No reason why you can't. I'm sure it works perfectly fine. Another feature you will see on router planes is holes in order for adding a base plate onto the router. So here the Stanley has a couple of holes here. The Veritas has a couple of holes here for adding a base plate. There are times, as you'll see in my demonstration, when you might want a wider foot on the plane in order to cover a wider area. So that's what those holes are for. So they're handy. I don't happen to use that feature, but I can see where someone might take advantage of that feature to widen the base of the router plane.
So one of the things I use a router plane for most commonly is for doing inlay work. So imagine you have a design like this compass star that you want to inlay into the top of a box or something like that. So here's where the router plane really comes into its own. First, I trace the design with a nice deep cut, and I'm using the chisel here to outline the edges, the profile of my inlay design. Once I've done that, I can go to work with the router plane. Here I'm setting the depth of the router plane to the thickness of my piece of inlay. You can either do it as I was showing you there, holding it up, or laying it flat on the table and making sure that the router plane is cutting just a little bit shallower than the thickness of your inlay, so that the inlay protrudes slightly above the surface for scraping down flush later. So the small router planes are great for this. Here I am going to work on clearing out the waste in this area for inlaying this compass star. It's a matter of working with the grain. This walnut has very figured, so it has grain that goes all kinds of different directions and up and down, and you don't want to dig out any big chunks. So it's a matter of working around from different angles and maybe turning the board around different directions in order to get into the different parts of the design, especially a design that has as many edges and angles and pieces as this one does. You can see there I tilt the router plane up a little bit so I can get started into a cut and go. These blades, especially with these round shafted router plane blades, they can come loose pretty easily. So you can see me there with pliers, just snugging it up a bit. And I switched blades to this pointed blade so that I can get up into these corners a little more tightly in this design. This pointed blade is very handy for getting into the corners and the details of a design. So it's a matter of just working back and forth the grain at different angles, different parts, using the tip of the blade, using the angled side at kind of a skewing motion, whatever works here, just to get that pocket for the inlay design all down to the same depth. It's hard to get up into the very points there. I use a chisel for the very last little tip of the design, but this little point gets up pretty close to the very point of the design. Another thing I use a router plane for in my shop is for fine-tuning tenon. So here I'm getting ready to cut a tenon by hand with a tenon saw, and by the miracle video I'm almost done already. Here we go, sawing down to the shoulder of the cut. But that's not my final thickness. I now need to fine-tune this down to the thickness of my tenon. So this is where the router plane comes in handy. So the router plane, you'll notice I'm putting 1/2 of the router plane onto my board, and as you can see there, I'm applying a lot of downward pressure with my right hand, and then I'm using that as a pivot with my left hand, just pivoting the router plane around my right hand to shave the tenon down to the proper thickness. You can set the depth of the router blade right to your mark, and you get very precise results with this. Here's another view of using the router plane to dimension a tenon to the proper thickness. So that my right hand, left on your screen, is pressing down on the board with the corner of the router to hold it nice and steady at the proper depth, and then my left hand on your right is pivoting the router around the blade and around my right hand to keep the depth uniform and to shave the pieces off. So last few strokes and it's all set at the right depth. Another method is to take a board and put it on the other side of the tenon that's the same thickness as your original board, and now you have support on both sides of the tenon. This can work quite well, and now you start to work the tenon down to the proper thickness that way. Just like other things, you have to pay attention to the grain direction. If you can't go one direction, you turn it around, go the other direction, working from the outside back towards the middle, whatever works. It depends on the grain, the kind of wood, what kind of results you're getting and so forth. This is a very good way for dimensioning a tenon by hand right down to a very precise depth. Another valuable use for a router plane that you will find even if you do a lot of machine woodworking is making the depth of a dado uniform. So imagine you're making a bookcase, you have some dados across a board, and you find that the board has shifted a bit in its shape. Maybe it's cupped slightly since you dimensioned it a week ago, and now all of a sudden you put the dados in there with your dado blade, and it's not a uniform depth. So here's where you can take a router plane and set it to your desired depth, go across your dado with the router plane and set it to uniform depth, check your depth again, and now you've got a nice uniform depth to your dado.
I'd like to talk to you next about some differences between shoulder planes and rabbet planes to distinguish the two. They have a lot in common, but they also have some key differences that you should be aware of. First of all, the shoulder planes. Shoulder planes are more, I don't know if they're a more recent invention, but they're certainly of more recent popularity. There are a number of quality manufacturers for them. These two shoulder planes I have here point out some of the key features of a shoulder plane. First of all, generally modern shoulder planes are metal, although they don't have to be. They can be wooden bodied also. Shoulder planes are for finer work. They're for refining joints. They're for trimming tenons, as you'll see in this video, for cleaning up a rabbet, the shoulder of a joint. They're for fine work. Typically, a shoulder plane will have a blade that is straight across, that is not at an angle. It'll have a blade that'll go to both edges, so you can work either side of the plane. It will have a very small mouth for fine work, to take very fine shavings for adjusting a joint. Usually on a shoulder plane, there will not be any nicker. I'll explain what a nicker is in
in a second if you're not sure, but there'll be no nicker on a shoulder plane, again, because it works both sides and because of its purpose. And generally a shoulder plane will be a low angle plane. This is so that it can work end grain across a shoulder of a tenon, for example, or for working across the grain for refining a joint. So you'll see a low, usually they are low angle planes. They may have an adjustable mouth, which is great. Some of them might have a feature where you can remove the front of the plane to make it a bullnose plane to get up close to corners and so forth. So that's a shoulder plane. A rabbet plane, on the other hand, can be wood-bodied or metal bodies. Here's a wood shoulder plane. Here's a Stanley 85, which is a metal body rabbet plane. They can be either, and they both work great. So here's a shoulder plane, typical. It'll have a larger mouth. It'll have a blade that's often it'll be skewed. It doesn't have to be a rabbet plane, but often the blade is skewed for a rabbet plane, which means it's really designed for working in one direction and against one shoulder. It'll have a higher bed angle like this. And then especially with the wooden planes, this is a key to the difference in their purpose. The wooden shoulder planes I like particularly because they're often set up so that they will eject the shaving from making the rabbet very easily. Rabbet planes are for making rabbets. They're for removing a significant amount of wood, for making shavings, for creating a rabbet rather than fine tuning it. And so therefore, often the wooden ones have a provision for ejecting chips quite effectively, which is really nice, as this one does here. Sometimes a rabbet plane will have a nicker so that you can work across the grain. That's what this is here. This nicker can be tapped down with a hammer and with a sharpened edge there in order to cut the fibers as you cut across the grain. So this would be a very good plane for working across grain as well as with the grain. Whereas this one, very similar plane in many ways and almost identical in size, but it doesn't have a nicker. So you'd either have to either not use it to work across grain or find some other way to cut the fibers, such as making a saw cut across the fibers purse or a knife cut or something like that. These can be had really inexpensively if you shop around. This one still has my price tag on it. I forget where I got it, but I paid $25 for this wonderful solid rabbet plane. This one is nice. It has some boxing in it. Boxing is an inset of some harder wood along the wear points of the wood in order to make the plane last longer, to keep a sharper edge there. Or this could have been a repair. I suspect it's original to the plane, but sometimes you'll see boxing put in as a repair to a plane that's worn. This metal Stanley 85, it's much the same as the wooden ones. Here's the nicker, which is a three-pointed little blade that can be unscrewed and turned around so that the nicker is below the surface of the bed of the plane to cut the fibers. This one does not have a skewed blade. It has a straight blade here, but it's much the same function as the wooden bodied ones. You'll notice this one has a fence on it, which I'll talk about in a moment. So those are the key differences between shoulder planes and rabbet planes. Shoulder planes are for fine work. They tend to be set up for fine shavings, for cutting both across the grain and in both directions with the grain, whereas rabbet planes are more likely to be skewed, to have a larger mouth, a higher bed angle, to be designed to remove a lot of wood, and so therefore often they will have features to eject chips, and because of the skewed blade, they only work one direction on the wood. So looking at a little more detail at some rabbet planes, again, here's this wooden bodied one with the nicker, which allows us to cut across the grain. And here is the metal Stanley, which has very much the same feature. So these rabbet planes can be used to create rabbets, to actually remove a good chunk of wood. Another kind of rabbeting plane that you will see, or a plane that can make rabbets, is something called a moving philoster plane. When people think of moving philoster planes, they often think of wooden body planes like this one here. So here's a moving philoster plane. You'll notice it's much like a rabbet plane. It's got a skewed blade. It's designed for working right up into the corner of a wood to create a rabbet. This one has a nicker here. It also has a depth setting, which they may or may not have. This one happens to have a nice brass depth guide. The main difference between a traditional rabbet plane like this one and a moving philoster plane is that a moving Philister plane simply adds a fence. So you see the fence here, it's actually adjustable. You can loosen these screws and move this fence back and forth here to adjust the width of the cut that you're making. That's really the difference between a rabbet plane and a moving Philister plane. The advantage to this is that you don't have to set up the width of your rabbet in some other way ahead of time and sort of fuss with that. You can just go to work right with this, with the fence right against the edge of your board, and that will set the width of your rabbet automatically. Same here with this Stanley 85. It's set up so that it has a fence here that you can adjust and simply remove if you don't want to use it. It comes off easily enough. But because it's a rabbet plane with a moving adjustable fence, I really think that this is really more a moving Philister plane than it is a rabbet plane, but it might be just a semantic difference. These old Stanley metal rabbeting planes can be a great buy, and they work just fine once they're tuned up, adjusted, sharp blade, and so forth. But there's a few things to look for. They made a lot of different models of these. This model 85 is set up so that the blade can be moved from this position to the front to make it into a bullnose plane, which just means the blade is closer to the front to allow you to get up near a corner or the end of a stopped rabbet where you would just finish out the last half an inch or so with a chisel. So that's a feature of the 85. It also, as I mentioned before, it comes with the fence and the rod to hold the fence on here. So that's something to look for in the plane. And this one also comes with a depth stop that screws on here to automatically set the depth of cut. So you want to look for the depth stop. So if you're looking around for these, they can be had quite cheaply, but often they're missing these parts, the depth stop and the fence. You don't need those in order to make it a useful rabbet plane, but they're nice to have, and that's also obviously the way that the manufacturer intended for them to be provided. So if that's important to you, make sure you look for those. If the fence and or the depth stop are not included, then the price should reflect that. If you're looking to purchase a moving Philister plane, many of them are made in England and are often end up over here in the colonies from England. But if you're looking to purchase one, a wooden-bodied moving Philister plane, just one more thing to be aware of, and that is that these two planes look very similar. You might think that they're both moving Philister planes, but in fact they're not. And here's the key. If you look at the edge here, the blade comes right up to a 90-degree corner in order to be able to make a rabbet. This plane looks at first glance very similar. It has the moving fence, it has a skewed blade. You might glance at this and say, oh, this is a moving Philister plane. And in fact, it's not. And here's what gives it away. This cutout here, or this profile on the end of the plane, shows you that this is actually a panel raising plane. And if we look at the blade is sharpened on this side as well in order to make the cut along this edge here. So this plane is designed to cut a raised panel for a raised panel door or side of a cabinet or something like that. And so as a special purpose, might even classify this as a molding plane, but it's not a moving Philister plane. And because of this setup, it would be a difficult plane to use to make simple rabbets. So here we go, making a rabbet. In this case, I'm using the moving Philister plane, but it works very much the same way with a rabbeting plane. You'll notice I started towards the front of the cut and worked my way back. I'll show that again in another segment. But this blade is set to cut a fairly heavy cut, so I'm taking some pretty good shavings there. That works its way down through this pine pretty quickly here. And just fine tuning at the end there as I get close to the depth stop to get my final rabbet shape. Getting rid of some chips, pulling out the board, we have ourselves our rabbet in just a couple of minutes. Here I'm using the Stanley to cut a rabbet, and it's much the same process as with the wooden moving Philister plane. Again, notice I'm starting at the end of the cut, the far end of the cut, taking a few short strokes and then working back, making longer and longer strokes as I start to establish the cut. Once I've got the full length of the board, I can go to work and just work my way right down to the full depth that I'm going to, whether that's working down to a mark that I've scribed, or working down to the depth of the depth stop. It does a nice job. Another nice rabbet on the edge of the board. Here I'm using a shoulder plane to trim up a tenon on a joint. So the tenon's a little thick, and so I'm taking some slices off. The shoulder plane is set quite thin, so I'm not taking much with each shaving here, maybe half a thou of an inch or so, checking as I come down to my layout line.
Plow planes are one of my favorite hand planes to use in the wood shop. But I want to talk a little bit about plow planes, their advantages, and how they compare to combination planes. I really think plow planes and combination planes are really very similar to each other, and they're really on a continuum from a simplest plow plane to a very complicated combination plane. They do many of the same tasks, and so let's walk through that. This Veritas plow plane is a lovely tool to use. I really use it. This is called their small plow plane. Don't know why they call it their small plow plane, because they don't have a large plow plane in their catalog. But anyway, small plow plane. The features that make a plow plane are these. They have a handle set up to hold a blade, obviously, like all planes do. But the blade is designed to be held at a certain distance from a board. And so there'll be a movable fence on a plow plane or on a combination plane to allow you to set where that groove or where that dado is going to be cut from the edge or the end of the board. So that's the fence here. There's a cast piece, and then I've added this wooden fence on here to give me a little more support. That's typical of what you would do with a plow plane. So the plow plane has a fence to hold the blade a certain distance from the edge of the board. It usually has an interchangeable blade so that you can cut different widths of grooves in your board. Often it'll have a depth stop the way this one does here. This is depth stop, so it'll stop when you reach a certain depth of groove. This record 044 is very much the same as the Veritas. It has a fence here that is adjustable in distance from the blade. It has interchangeable blades, and it has a depth stop here, just like the Veritas. Combination planes like this Stanley 55 function much the same way. Here's our fence. It's pulled all the way over at the moment, but we have a fence that will move in and out to set the distance from the blade. We have an interchangeable blade, which this one doesn't have a blade in the moment, but it has an interchangeable blade and a handle for making the cut. So this functions very much the way a simpler plow plane does. I really love this record 044 that I picked up at a woodworking show as a used tool. I don't remember paying a lot for it. I think under $50, which is great for the quality of tool it is. It's got good stiff cast parts. It's got a number of interchangeable blades. It's a more modern tool. It has a plastic handle, but I didn't buy this to be a collector's item. I bought it in order to be a working tool. And actually this handle is quite comfortable to use. And so the wonderful design, the castings, and the number of interchangeable blades with it, for what I paid for it, I thought it was just a steal. So here's the number of interchangeable blades. This one, it must be a pretty recent manufacturer, because I have a set here of metric blades, everything from 4mm metric to 12mm metric. And then I've got a 1/16 of an inch to half an inch in imperial sizes. So this is quite a nice set. Didn't cost me a lot of money. It's really quite a nice tool and a joy to use. The Veritas tool is also a very nice tool to use. It's functionally very similar to the record. It's a little bit lighter in construction and slightly smaller, but that does not seem to hamper its function at all. It seems to work quite well. It has a nice wooden handle, and it also comes with a few different blades. Some of these come with the plane, and then some of you have to buy separately. I built this box to hold everything here and keep it all nice and neat, but you'll see here there's blades, everything from 1/8 of an inch up to 3/4 of an inch in width for grooves. And then this one also has some blades for making tongues, also for making tongue and groove joints. So this is where I say that this starts to merge a little bit between just a simple plow plane for making simple rectangular grooves and a combination plane where you can start to get some other functions here. The Stanley 55 is a very complicated plane, and it's the one that people often think of as kind of the epitome of a combination plane. As you can see here, it has all these different fixtures. I even have some things here that aren't attached to it, different depth stops and guides and so forth. But in its simplest form, if we pull off some of these fancy features here, we're down to a simple skate with rods for adjusting the distance of the blade from the cut. And as you can see here, as we remove some of the fancy bits, this is really starting to look a lot like a simple plow plane. A common task for a plow plane in the woodworking shop is for making grooves for the bottoms of drawers. In fact, one of my plow planes set up, it just sits there all the time with a 1/4-inch blade in it just for that purpose. Plow planes are wonderful tools. They do have a couple of peculiarities. One is that the fence and the mechanism for holding the fence at the proper distance, they're notorious for loosening up and shifting a bit on you. So whatever your plow plane is, whatever style it has, you want to make sure that those connections for holding that fence in place are really, really snug when you get ready to use it. Similarly, the depth stop on a lot of these planes tends to slip around a bit unless you have it really, really tight. So I will confess, I'm not above grabbing a pair of pliers and snugging these up just a little bit more to make sure they don't move on me. When using a plow plane, you want to make sure that you keep the blade nice and vertical so that you get a nice clean groove. And you want that fence to ride right along the edge of the board at all times. So getting used to the idea of holding the plane in a way that gives you good control over it is part of learning how to use these. In addition, you want a way to hold your board securely. You want the length of your board to be nice and free so there's no obstructions for the plane, and yet you want it held in place. Generally speaking, you don't have to hold the board itself down. That can be kind of hard to get clamps on here in a way that allow you to not obstruct the path of the plane. But a nice hooked board like this piece of 1/2-inch plywood can work well as a bench stop. I've got my board locked into place here. My push is down and against the fence and against this direction. And so my board here on the bench should hold it nicely in place as I do my planing. Generally, in order to start this kind of a plane, it's much like rabbet planes and other sorts of planes where you're removing a lot of wood from the board. You want to start at the far end, near the end of your stroke. And you want to start with short strokes here at this end to remove wood at that part of the board and gradually work your way back, taking a longer and longer stroke as you work. Notice how I'm pushing in against the board, a little bit of downward pressure, but mostly I'm pushing in to make sure that fence rides right along the edge of my board consistently throughout the whole process here. I find this very satisfying work. The noise of the plane going to work through the wood, the sound gives you a lot of feedback on how the plane is working. And instead of getting all kinds of sawdust that then you have to worry about collecting or breathing in, you get these nice curls or shavings, which not only are easier to clean up, but you can put to great use later if you happen to have a fireplace or a fire pit, something like that. They make great fire starting material. Here I am, I'm down to my depth stop. Pretty much done here. There we go. There's my groove, all done in just a matter of a few seconds. Having talked about simpler plow planes, I want to talk about combination planes a little bit. And what tool collector wouldn't go nuts for a wonderful combination plane? For example, this Stanley 55, what a miracle of the late Industrial Revolution. Look at all of that cast metal. What tool collector just wouldn't go nuts over something like that? Combination planes, plow planes, there really is a line that starts to blur here. Take, for example, this Stanley number 50. This is an English-made Stanley number 50. It's not a very old tool. You can tell from the design and the logos and stuff on it. This is a post-World War II plane, I'm sure. Beautiful little plane. It's really a lot like the plow planes that I showed you earlier. It has a number of cutters that come with it. It's got grooving blades here and also some beading planes and also a tongue and groove plane here, much like the Veritas small plow plane. Stanley calls it a combination plane, I guess because it has this variety of cutters. But it really, you know, whether you call this a plow plane or whether you call it a combination plane, we're really starting to skirt the line there. This is a very nice plane. It's very comfortable to hand. The only thing I would say is a downside to this number 50 is there's really no easy way to attach an additional longer or deeper fence on this the way there are on the Record 44 and the Veritas. So that's one downside of this. But other than that, it's absolutely a beautiful, beautiful tool. The Stanley 45 and the Stanley 55 for tool collectors are often considered kind of the epitome of these fancy combination planes. The 45 is slightly less elaborate than the 55, but both of these, as I showed you before, if you take off some of the gobbledygook here, really you're starting to look at something that really is just a plow plane in basic form. The 45 has this nice handle here that's actually quite nice for planing with, but this is a tool that looks very much like the plow planes that we've seen here. Similarly, the 55, when you take all these different bits and pieces off, we end up with something that looks very much like a basic plow plane. The Stanley 55 really is a marvel of engineering, but it's probably as much a marvel of marketing as anything. I mean, look at this thing. Who wouldn't go nuts over something like this? And look at all the different cutters you get with it. There's plow blades for cutting grooves. There's hollows and rounds. There's whatever you call this shape here. There's beading planes of all kinds of different dimensions, reeding and fluting blades, and some molding blades thrown into the mix also here. It's an amazing set of tools, and the concept of a tool where one thing will do everything is really just a wonderful thought. However, in reality, I think, especially for the purposes of this video, where it's really talking about specialty planes for the beginner, I don't think there's any reason for a woodworker these days to have one of these tools. They're really cool, but they're really kind of an extravagance. And I don't know that they're really all that practical in the sense that anytime you want to change from one kind of cutter to another, let's say you're cutting a groove to put in a drawer bottom, but then you want to switch and you want to do a bead on the edge of a board. You have to stop and take apart the plane, readjust it, change the blade, readjust all the settings and so forth, just to switch from one purpose to another. And how many of these different things are we actually going to use anyway within 5 years of woodworking? I think it's better just to have a couple of specialized planes for a few specific purposes. A plow plane for plowing, a beading plane for beading, maybe a molding plane for a molding that you might use fairly frequently. I think that's a lot more practical than trying to have one plane that attempts to do it all. So a Stanley 55 is a wonderful collector's item. It does work. It does what it claims to do if you know how to set it up right and adjust it properly. But I don't believe it's really a tool that today's hand woodworker is really going to use on a regular basis. The last specialty plane that I'd like to talk to you about is a beading plane. Now, all of the combination planes and some of the plow planes that we've talked about will do beading. They have blades that will do beading just fine, and that's wonderful. Frankly, though, I love these old wooden beading planes, these old molding style beading planes. They have such history involved in them, and it's one of the places where I think it's worthwhile to have a specialty plane, a plane that's dedicated to beading, as opposed to needing to change out the blades in a combination plane or a grooving plane. So these have a lot of history. You wonder, why do I have so many? Well, they're different sizes, right? Different size beads. So this one is a 1/8. This one is a 1/4. They're marked on the end, as you can tell. This one's 3/8, and this one's 7/16. So they each do different size beads. But in addition to that, they also have a wonderful amount of history with them. Wooden body planes are a total rabbit hole in and of themselves in woodworking and in tool collecting. I've gone down that rabbit hole a little bit. I just love the history that's involved in some of these. For example, this 7/16 inch, this is a 3/8 inch plane. This one says Union Tool Company, Goshen, Massachusetts. It does not have an owner's mark on it. It has a few marks from a previous owner, but no owner's mark. This one is made by Pearson's Oxford. There's also a Sheffield mark here. Maybe the blade was made in Sheffield. And there's an owner's mark, several places on it, R. Bliss. This one is Buck Tools, Edgewater Road in London, owned by a G. Margrave. So G. Margrave was the owner of that one at one point. And this one is the John Mosley and Sons of Broad Street, Bloomsbury, London. And the maker's mark is a T. Lee for the 1/8 one. So they have a lot of history in them. I just love using these wooden planes. They feel good in the hands. They work wonderfully if you tune them up and have a nice sharp blade. They're just a joy to use.
So here I am using one of my beading planes to put a bead on the rail board for the King Bed project, which I showed at a previous meeting. And it's like using any other plane. You start up at the far end and keep working your way back down the board. It doesn't really take very many strokes to put the profile in. I'm doing this in red oak here. I'm going a little bit against the grain, so it's fighting me a little bit, but it really doesn't take a lot, and you'll see how quickly I get the whole board done here. By the time I get my router out to try to do this, I'm done with this board and on the other side of the bed and done pretty quickly. So I've gotten to the end, and now just to run down the whole length of the board to make sure it's all of uniform profile and depth.
So there we go, woodworking friends. That's my little expose on basic specialty planes, essential specialty planes. Hopefully there's information there for people who are new to woodworking or new to this kind of woodworking, and maybe a few tips or hints or suggestions that might be of value to more experienced folks out there too. You know, every time I demonstrate this, I've been to a couple woodworking shows as a part of the Woodworkers Guild to, and I'll demonstrate something like this. And invariably someone will come up to me and say, oh, I got a router that could do that in 5 minutes, that kind of thing. And maybe that's true. I don't know if you take into account all the time to set up the router and get the bit the right height. And, I don't know. If you're only doing a couple of boards, I'll bet I can do it faster with my hand planes than you can router start to finish. But maybe it's faster, but I'm not into woodworking for the speed. I'm in it for the enjoyment of making something with my hands, for the skill involved in it. If I wanted furniture fast, I'd go buy it at IKEA and slap it together, and I'd be done in a couple of hours. That's not what I'm into woodworking for. I'm in it for the meditative value of it, the peacefulness of it, the joy of developing a skill and making something with my own hands. I love the hand tools. The more woodworking I do, the more hand tools I'm using. It's quiet. If I want to listen to music while I'm woodworking, I can do that. Or if I just don't want any noise at all, just the quiet of the planing is a wonderful noise. You get shavings instead of dust. I don't need a dust collection. I just need a broom at the end of the work. And there's a certain amount of skill involved. Well, in any tool, but certainly with the hand tools, I love the fact that that it's a skill that I develop with a certain amount of practice. I can get good at this and get great results with these hand tools, some of which are new and some of which have a lot of history to them. So I hope you enjoyed this.